Okay, so welcome everybody to this third session of a very thought-provoking series of classes. Tonight, it's my delight and honor to introduce you to Avinoam Patt. Some of you already know him and have had the pleasure of learning with and from him, but the others here tonight, for the others, I now get to tell you a bit about him. If I were to tell you all about him, we would not have time for the class tonight. So I will summarize some of his accomplishments. A little history first. When Avi came to the University of Hartford, he served as the Philip Feltman Professor of Modern Jewish History. He was the co-director of the Maurice Greenberg Center for Judaic Studies. He was the director of Museum of Jewish Civilization, executive director of the Heroes Center, that's Holocaust Education Research and Outreach, supervised the Rwanda Genocide Education and Teacher Training Program, directed, in our own words, an interview project with children and grandchildren of Holocaust survivors. So in case he had a little extra time, for 2 years he served as a JTS fellow from 2015 to 2017, and that's the way some of you in this room got to know Avi. And he was responsible for presenting at least 10 public programs in Greater Hartford, the Greater Hartford community, on behalf of JTS, and some of us were very fortunate to have Avi as our instructor. Prior to coming to the university, Avi worked at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, Center for Advanced Holocaust Studies in Washington, D.C. He's worked at EVO. He has received many awards and grants. He's published 10 books as author or editor, 26 articles and book chapters. There's probably more since I checked. 7 book reviews, 8 encyclopedia articles, 18 museum catalogs and curated exhibitions, 4 web publications. He has developed curricula, served as the historical consultant on 6 documentary films. And while he was at the University of Hartford, he was also a visiting professor at UConn, Trinity, and Clark. He has taught in adult education programs outside the walls of higher ed. He delivered 24 peer-reviewed conference presentations, many conference presentations, chaired or organized many conference sessions, delivered many invited addresses, presented in the community many times. He engaged in very important work in the state of Connecticut to get Connecticut legislation on Holocaust and genocide education passed. And then, unfortunately for us, but for Avi, a good move, he moved to UConn to serve as the Doris and Simon Konover Chair of Judaic Studies and Director of the Center for Judaic Studies and Contemporary Jewish Life. And he's a real mensch. I give you Avi Patt.
Wow, Regina, that's the best introduction I've ever received. I'm glad that my parents are on the call tonight. And I think Mom and Dad, she probably did that for you. So thank you. Thank you for that, Regina. I appreciate it. I'm, as funny as it is to say, I am looking forward to meeting with all of you tonight to discuss Jews and anti-Semitism in the modern period, because I think it will be, while it's a timely topic and a disturbing topic, I think it will also be interesting for us to see what we can figure out about the interaction between anti-Semitism and Jewish identity in the modern period. I will mention that before I begin my formal remarks, I'll just mention that in 2 weeks from tonight, we will host the concluding session of this series with Dina Grant, Jonathan Ellikin, and myself, because there have been so many through lines of the history, the past and present, of anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism, that it'll be interesting for the 3 of us to join together on a panel to discuss this. So we're going to do that in 2 weeks on November 9th. And I'm going to be sending you a separate Zoom link for that actual program on November 9th. So just want to make sure that you know about that from a scheduling perspective. So in a moment, I'm going to share my screen with you, and I have prepared a PowerPoint and some slides and images for us to discuss. But I want to provide a few sort of framing questions for us to consider as we think about anti-Semitism in the modern period, or Jews and anti-Semitism in the modern period. So one thing that's been interesting for us to consider as we've studied this topic together with Jonathan and with Dina is what have been the changes in traditional anti-Judaism from the ancient period into the medieval period and now into the modern period. And one of the questions we have to understand is what has changed over time. I'm also interested, as you'll see, or you may have seen in the article that I shared with you by Michael Meyer, in this question of how did Jews respond to anti-Semitism? And what can we learn about the differing ways in which Jews responded to anti-Semitism or anti-Judaism in antiquity, in the Middle Ages, and in the modern period? And what can those differing Jewish responses to anti-Semitism tell us about, on the one hand, the ways in which Michael Meyer would ask us to think about the ways in which anti-Semitism has influenced or shaped Jewish identity through history, but also in the ways in which Jews have conceived of themselves differently over time and conceived of their relationship to the outside world differently over time, and the ways in which anti-Semitism has or has not affected them differently based on that self-conception. I do ask myself, as we engage in this discussion, the question of how useful is it for us to examine the sources of anti-Semitism? What can we learn in trying to, quote unquote, understand anti-Semitism? Because on the one hand, we can say that anti-Semitism is a completely irrational belief in a disproportionate power and malevolent influence of the Jew and Judaism in the world. And we know it's irrational. So what is the point of us trying to apply our rational thinking power to understand something that is irrational, right? I think this is something that I'd like for us to examine and to discuss. Would we be better served from the perspective of Jewish history, not necessarily trying to understand anti-Semitism, but trying to understand how Jews have responded to the threat of anti-Semitism? And as I suggested, it's interesting for us to consider how anti-Semitism has shaped the forms of Jewish identity in the modern period. At the end of class tonight, I want us to think about which responses have been more effective, which responses have been less effective. And I do this with an eye for us to think about our contemporary moment. And I want to, at the end of class, leave in the contemporary moment and think about what we might do about the present state of anti-Semitism in the world today. So when we engage with this question, we obviously need to look both backwards and forwards. Backwards in the sense of how did the anti-Semitism experienced by Jews in the modern period differ from what we have discussed in class this far? What were the changes as Jews encountered modernity, or as the modern period began, that distinguished this anti-Semitism? And how might the continuation of an irrational fear of the Jew and Jewish influence on the world challenge our understandings of what we think of as modern or modernity, or perhaps our own belief in progress? That is, if we believe that the world is continuously moving forward and progressing, I think a belief that has been sorely challenged of late, then does the presence or return of anti-Semitism challenge that belief in progress? And if we've invested so much in progress in terms of the place of the Jews and the relationship with the outside world, then what does this return of sort of an irrational fear of the Jew make us think about the place or the belief in progress? So that's a look backwards. But I also want to remind us as we engage with this, because this comes up all the time, and as you'll see, we're going to focus to a great extent on the origins of what we'll call modern anti-Semitism in the 19th century in particular. But I think in terms of looking forwards from the middle of the 19th century, we have to remind ourselves at all times not to draw a straight line from what we're going to be discussing in terms of the development of 19th century anti-Semitism to the rise of Hitler, the Nazis, and eventually the Holocaust. And as you'll see, this has, as we've already discussed in class, played a major influence on the ways in which we try to understand and assess anti-Semitism. That is, if we could understand it, we could perhaps understand where Hitler and the Nazis come from. And if we can understand that, we can perhaps understand why the Holocaust happened. I'm not sure that that's a question that we can answer, but I will say that it definitely influences the ways in which we interpret the anti-Semitism that we're going to discuss today. And you'll see what I mean as we go on. One way to think about this is, if you had asked someone at the end of the 19th century, which country in Europe was most likely to initiate the massacre of its Jews and the Jewish population in Europe, they would not have told you Germany. They might have said Russia. They might have, under the influence of the Dreyfus Affair, thrown France in there for good measure. But it's unlikely that they would have suggested that Germany would be the place that would initiate the mass murder of European Jewry at that point in time. And so that's my word of caution about going forward, right? Using the benefit of hindsight to understand the history that we are looking at. So I keep using this term modern, and I think one question that we have to understand is, what do I mean by modern when I'm talking about the modern period or Jewish responses to anti-Semitism in the modern period? And what I'll do is I now will share my screen now that I've talked enough, so you can see my PowerPoint slideshow. And okay, so some images to consider as we engage with this. References to anti-Semitism, and somebody asked me if I was going to be talking about humor in this class, because I do like to talk a lot about humor, and so there are some hints here that I might engage with humor in this class, but also in other ways in which anti-Semitism has influenced the development of modern Jewish identity. So one thing that I'll say right off the bat is that when we try to understand sort of the Jewish encounter with anti-Semitism in the modern period, we have to understand what we mean by modern. What are we looking for when we discuss modernity? And as Jonathan alluded to last week, different historians conceive of history differently, and their periodization is different. And Jonathan and I might suggest different dates for what we would describe as the end of the Middle Ages or the end of the medieval period of history and the beginning of the modern period of history. And it won't surprise you to hear that when we look at the ways in which different historians of the Jews have written about Jewish history, they also date this process, the beginning of the modern period, differently. So, and the ways in which they understand the Jewish encounter with the outside world also influence the ways in which they understand the influence of anti-Semitism on the Jews. So I'm showing you here a picture of Shimon Dubnov as one example. Nobody does this anymore, but Dubnov and Salo Baron, for those of you who heard Beryl Lang's lecture last week on Wednesday night, are historians who wrote these grand sweeping histories of the Jews, multi-volume histories of the Jews from the earliest times until the present days. And of course, they had to divide into periodizations. Sorry, let me just let somebody in. And so these historians, depending on how they understood the influence or the encounter between the Jews and the world around them, explained anti-Semitism in very different ways. So Dubnov, for example, was a historian who emphasized the ability of Jews in Eastern Europe to establish and develop their own autonomous societies, their own distinctive civilization. And he saw a great deal of success for the Jews in Eastern Europe in developing autonomous and distinctive civilizations in Eastern Europe. So his assessment of anti-Semitism was very different from the assessment of somebody like Ben Sion Dinur, who was one of the foremost historians, Zionist historians of Jewish history, one of the developers of what comes to be called the Jerusalem School, who situated the encounter between Jews and the outside world in a very different way through what we would call kind of a Zionist conception of history in terms of the relationship between Jews and the diaspora, and how the diaspora had shaped Jewish identity in a way that necessitated the return of the Jewish people to the land of Israel to be able to function in the world around them. Now you could see that assessment of, do we say that Jews are able to successfully flourish in the surrounding world? I'll come back to Shmuel Ettinger in a moment. Like someone like Salo Baron, who Beryl Lang spoke about last week on Wednesday night, Jews flourished in the diaspora. Jews have been incredibly successful in the diaspora. Baron would assess anti-Semitism very differently from someone like Shmuel Ettinger I showed you before, or Ben Sion Dinur, right? Anti-Semitism was such a malevolent influence on the Jews, according to somebody like Dinur, that the only solution for the Jews to continue functioning in the world was to return to the land of Israel, to form their own Jewish national identity. Baron, on the other hand, would say, why do we focus so much on those bitter periods in Jewish history, those periods of persecution, when we know that there are long stretches of time in between persecutions when Jews flourish in the diaspora, right? Perhaps we should be focusing on those times, not the negative conceptions of Jewish history. And so it won't surprise you, for those of you who are familiar with sort of Jewish life in America, that most of the historians who come to ply their trade here in the United States and write Jewish history in America and write about the experiences of Jewish communities in the diaspora tend to accentuate those positive elements of the Jewish encounter with the societies around them. I don't say that they minimize the influence of anti-Semitism, but they say we can't just focus on anti-Semitism. We have to focus on the broad scope. We have to look at the ways in which Jews have succeeded and flourished in their encounter with the surrounding world. And the Zionist historians, on the other hand, say, look at history from a different way and suggest all of this points to the need for the Jews to give up on the diaspora, leave the diaspora, and move to Israel, right? And depending on what you're looking for, this will influence the way in which you read and interpret this history. So I point all of this out because, and we're not reading these and discussing this in class, but we have prominent historians who interpret the influence of anti-Semitism or anti-Judaism in very different ways, depending on sort of, let's call it either political viewpoints or historiographic influences on the way, what are they looking for when they write the history of the Jews throughout history. Both here you have Jacob Katz in medieval and modern times. Okay. So this is a little bit of a preview for our discussion of how we're going to interpret the Jewish encounter with the modern world. And why am I showing you a picture of Haredi children in a Purim carnival? Because it's also important for us to understand how powerful the sort of narrative of anti-Semitism has been on the Jewish self-conception. It's the joke that reduces every Jewish holiday to, they tried to kill us, we won, let's eat, right? But that conception of Jewish history and Jewish religious practice has exercised a very powerful sort of component of self-understanding, right? This idea that there always are genocidal maniacs who are trying to come along to destroy the Jewish people. You can go from Haman and work your way forward. And the Jewish people have suffered, but they have endured, they have survived, and they will suffer, and they will endure, and they will survive until the Mashiach comes, right? So there is this component of a Jewish self-understanding that exercises a very powerful way in which Jews understand this history. Somebody last week at Beryl's lecture asked the question of like, well, yeah, why do we focus so much on persecution? Why don't we focus on the fruitful periods? And there are ways in which this is very much ingrained into sort of Jewish religious practice as well. And we can try to understand this perhaps when we discuss this further on. Jonathan last week talked about this dilemma, right? Do we focus on the massacres that take place in the First Crusades, or do we focus on the relatively peaceful coexistence at the time? Which one should get more more emphasis. I'm going to skip ahead, just showing you these examples. We've already talked about some of these cases of persecutions that happened throughout Jewish history, including those of the First Crusade in the medieval period, or the expulsion from Spain. I'm not going to play Mel Brooks singing his Inquisition song here, but you can think about how this exercises sort of a powerful influence on Jewish self-conception. But I want to start here to look at sort of the influence of persecution on Jews in the modern period. And what I'm showing you here is what's referred to in Jewish history as Gzerot Takh-Tat, or the Cossack Revolt of 1648 to roughly 1645. For those of you who are not familiar with this period in history, essentially the Ukrainian Bogdan Khmelnytsky led a popular revolt of Cossacks against Polish nobility. Jews became the primary targets as the Polish nobles who had been sort of oppressing Ukrainian peasants on their vast estates in Ukraine and present-day Poland. Bogdan Khmelnytsky led this revolt, and the Polish nobility, who retreated behind the walls of their fortresses, left their very vulnerable estate owners and moneylenders and commercial agents who were living comfortably in their shtetls in Eastern Europe, that is the Jews, left them vulnerable. And so this period of the Cossack revolt was also a horrible period in terms of widespread destruction of Jewish life in Eastern Europe, 1648 to 1655 approximately. The estimate is, and we don't have exact numbers, and it's hard to calculate, but tens of thousands of Jews were killed during the Cossack revolts. You will see during the Khmelnytsky massacres, you will see numbers as high as 100,000. I don't know if that's an accurate number or not, but let's say tens of thousands. So I present this example. It's 1648 to 1655. And I ask the question, is this modern, right? Well, it's not modern in Eastern Europe because the modern period had not exactly begun in Eastern Europe. And at the same time, there is a guy in Amsterdam by the name of Baruch or Benedict de Spinoza, who is beginning to spout all kinds of ideas that we would think of as modern and enlightened. And this is happening at the exact same time in Amsterdam. So I point this out because one thing that's interesting for us to conceive of is that modernity begins in different places at different times. And so we can't look for a specific date to say when the modern period begins. We have to instead say that we're looking for specific processes of modernization. That is, we're looking for enlightenment, we're looking for the struggle for emancipation, we're looking for religious reform, we're looking for the birth of modern Jewish political thought. But it's also interesting for us to consider the ways in which Jews respond to these types of persecutions and how they understand it in terms of their worldview. So the Cossack revolt, or the Khmelnytsky massacres that take place, in which horrible persecutions of Jews, really just particularly brutal. I'm not going to read this here, but children being slaughtered, people being disemboweled, Jews being targeted, it points to their vulnerability. How do Jews understand it? Well, in large part, it is the dying is understood as an act of Kiddush Hashem, a way of sanctifying God's name, of choosing to be martyred rather than being forced to desecrate Judaism through conversion or otherwise. And I point this out because I think it's interesting for us to consider when we think about modern responses to anti-Semitism, at what point do Jews change the way in which they understand persecution, the way in which they understand their own agency, and the own way in which they think, well, should I be responding to this differently? Should this influence the way in which I conceive of my place in the world? Should this lead me to question my belief in an all-powerful God? Should I wait for God to intervene on my own behalf? Or should I organize some type of response that is communal, that is political in a way that we would understand it, right? So this is one of the things that I want us to think about when we think about how anti-Semitism differs in the modern period. I'm going to skip ahead to the Haskalah, because I think when we talk about the advent of modernity and the beginning of the modern period, we have to talk about Moses Mendelssohn. We have to talk about the Haskalah. We have to talk about the birth of the Jewish Enlightenment. Those of you who have taken classes with me on modern Jewish history know that I will spend some time on Mendelssohn. But for tonight's purposes, it's important for us to understand that Mendelssohn in Berlin, active, let's say from the 1750s roughly until the 1780s, embarks on this project of the Jewish Enlightenment, of the Haskalah, essentially to demonstrate to those around him that the Jewish people are a people of European culture, worthy of admittance into European society. And in a sense, Mendelssohn embarks on this process to demonstrate that Jews are worthy of admission into European society while not converting out of their Judaism, right? Jews do not have to convert and leave Judaism in order to demonstrate that they are a people of culture, in a sense, partly in a response to a challenge, right? Mendelssohn, if you are so enlightened, if you want to be considered to be the greatest philosopher of your day in Berlin in the middle of the 18th century, then show how enlightened you are and convert to Christianity. And Mendelssohn takes upon himself this project to demonstrate that Judaism is a religion of culture. Now, one of the outcomes of this process that we see with Mendelssohn and the Haskalah is the beginning of what we would call in 18th and 19th century Germany, the emergence of new forms of Jewish religious identity, the adaptation of Jewish religiosity, a remarkable type of religious reform that takes place, a transformation of the idea of what it means to be Jewish, the possibility to be a German of the Jewish faith. And if you know a little bit about this history, you know that this is when we begin to see the emergence of the Reform movement in Germany in the 19th century, changes in the type of religious worship, incorporating German language into prayer, less Hebrew into prayer, change in the position of the rabbi, using the sermon, right? All these developments that begin to develop in 19th century Germany that also, I'm sorry if I freeze for a moment, I'll be back. It's telling me my internet connection is unstable. I apologize. I'll always be back if you lose me for a second. One of the components that we see here is that the development also of what we would today call conservative or positive historical Judaism and modern Orthodoxy. And I point this out because historians from an earlier period were often critical of Germany, viewing its history teleologically, right, backwards, and saying, aha, what is the point in time in German history when we can begin to see the origins of Nazism? And the truth is that we understand sort of what is the successful creation of a German Jewish subculture and a flourishing of Jewish life in Germany in the 1800s and even into the beginning of the 20th century, we wouldn't look at it backwards and we'd say, oh, actually Jews did quite well in Germany in this period, where we see Germany becoming a place of experimentation, where you see the creation of a spectrum of possible Jewish responses to the promise of modernity. Of course, there is a flip side to this, which is what we're here to discuss in this class. And while on the one hand, we see what we would describe as sort of the triumph of the liberal idea, the idea of sort of adapting forms of Jewish religious observance in order to become more part of German society, but also the way in which this unfolds in Germany. And in a moment, I'll come back to Mendelssohn in a second. Let me just go to this map. No, okay, I don't have it here. I'll come to the map. In a moment, I'm going to show you a map that shows you the periods in time where Jews are emancipated throughout Europe. And one of the interesting things that happens is that while Jews in Germany gain emancipation not until 1871, that is, they don't become citizens of the newly created German state until 1871. In France, they become citizens in 1791, right after the French Revolution in 1789. But there is a distinction that is made between the deal, in a sense, of what it will take for Jews to become citizens of France. Because let's remember, Jews in this context are still viewed suspiciously. So in France, the arrangement is, Jews, we will give you everything as individuals, but nothing as a nation. You cannot have dual loyalty. You have to prove your loyalty to France. And in a famous series of tests that Napoleon gives to the Jews as part of the Sanhedrin, he is essentially testing Jewish loyalty to France, making sure that Jews will be loyal to France, not a nation within a nation. Yes, a religious group, but Frenchmen who happen to be Jewish. In Germany, it takes the greater part of the 19th century for Jews to obtain citizenship. And so in this period of time, yes, there is a great deal of suspicion, but as Jews are, sorry, I'm just letting somebody else into the class. As Jews are engaging with the surrounding society, we see all of this experimentation that is taking place, including in the case of Moses Mendelssohn and his family, the conversion of all of his grandchildren, who Mendelssohn's children are Jewish, but Mendelssohn's grandchildren are raised as Christians, including in the case of Felix Mendelssohn, the famous composer. And this is a case which I think is interesting for us to examine in this regard, because while we see Jews who are participating in German society and participating in the creation of German culture, and even perhaps converting to Christianity, but continuing to participate in the case of Felix keeping his grandfather's name, we also begin to see a great deal of suspicion of what we would call the Jewish influence on German culture. And so the most famous example of this is with Richard Wagner, who is not only skeptical of Mendelssohn's musical talent and his romantic influence, his influence on German music, but also on the idea that one can convert out of one's Judaism and that influence leaves as soon as one converts. And so as Wagner famously writes in 1850 in his treatise Jewry and Music, we have to explain to ourselves the involuntary repellence possessed for us by the nature and personality of the Jews, so as to vindicate the instinctive dislike which we plainly recognize as stronger and more overpowering than our conscious zeal to rid ourselves thereof. Although the peculiarities of the Jewish mode of speaking and singing come out the most glaringly in the commoner class of Jew, who has remained faithful to his father's stock, and though the cultured son of Jewry takes untold pains to strip them off, nevertheless they show an impertinent obstinacy in cleaving to him. Mendelssohn, Felix Mendelssohn, has shown us that a Jew may have the amplest store of specific talents, may own the finest and most varied culture, the highest and tenderest sense of honor, yet without all these preeminences helping him, we're but one single time to call forth in us that deep, that heart-searching effect which we await from art. The washiness and whimsicality of our present musical style has been pushed to its utmost pitch by Mendelssohn's endeavor to speak out a vague and almost nugatory content as interestingly and spiritedly as possible. Wagner was convinced that no matter how cultured Mendelssohn pretended to be, no matter how assimilated Mendelssohn was, he could not lose that Jewish influence that came down to him through a hereditary manner. And so this is one of these interesting developments that we have to understand. It is the beginning of what we might think of as a racial conception of Jews and Jewishness, that you cannot convert out of your Jewishness. Later in 1881, Wagner would write to Ludwig II, King of Bavaria, "I hold the Jewish race to be the born enemy of pure humanity and everything noble in it. It is certain that it is running us Germans into the ground. And I'm perhaps the last German who knows how to hold himself upright in the face of Judaism, which already rules everything." So what do we see here? What we're seeing is the influence, we're seeing the influence of a question or a debate around whether or not Jews should become citizens of the lands in which they're living. And as I discussed, while this happens early on in France and Jews are granted citizenship in one fell swoop in 1791, in Germany it's a much longer process, and there is a much greater debate about what it means to be authentically German. In France, you're born in France, you speak French, you are defined as French. In Germany, because of the way in which the German state is formed, because it is an amalgamation of various different principalities where you have Prussia and Bavaria and smaller states like Baden-Württemberg and others, there is a much larger debate about what does it mean to be German? Is Austria part of Germany or not, right? Is there something authentically, culturally German? And of course, the Jew is held up to the question of, can Jews become real Germans, right? And so you have opponents and enemies of the Jews who, when Jews are granted citizenship in Germany, say this will lead to the ultimate defeat of Germany. This is a mistake of colossal proportions, because what we have done by allowing Jews to obtain German citizenship is we have begun the process of leading to the defeat of our new German state. These people are not authentically German. They do not possess sufficient amounts of they can never become fully German. And so, by the way, and I included this in the readings that I gave you, we have sort of second-rate thinkers like Wilhelm Marr, who is most famous for coining this term anti-Semitism. And I think, as Joel alluded to, sort of raised this question last week or the week before about whether we should even use a term like this, right? That is coined by an anti-Semite who proudly defines his identity against Jews, right? Should we use a term that's invented by someone like Wilhelm Marr, who says, right, he warns that the Jewish spirit and Jewish consciousness have overpowered the world. He calls for resistance against the foreign power before it's too late. He thought that before long there will be absolutely no public office, even the highest one, which the Jews will not usurp. And he's proud to be called an anti-Semite. So it is individuals like Wilhelm Marr, or I also had you read a piece by Houston Stewart Chamberlain, who's actually a British thinker who really wants to be German, who begins to sort of articulate and answer this question, which is an obsession over this sort of debate about, well, can Jews really become German? And if they are not capable of sort of becoming German, culturally German, authentically German, of obtaining German citizenship, then they have to explain why this is not possible. And so you can see here, on the basis of newly emerging fields of science like anthropology, it's believed that there are different groups that could be studied and defined. And this is very much influenced by what comes to be called social Darwinism. So you take sort of Darwin's theories about evolution and survival of the fittest and the difference between species, and you apply it to different social groups. And the sort of pseudoscience that becomes racial science tries to explain and divide the world according to this artificial social construct that there are different racial groups, and tries to ascribe to these different racial groups certain inherent characteristics. And it tries to prove it's a pseudoscience because it reverses its hypothesis and its thesis. It takes its answer, which is that there are inherent differences between groups, and then it tries to use science to prove those differences. So, for example, Chamberlain would argue that racial difference was defined by mental characteristics. That meant that the Aryan race was creative, loyal, and responsible, while Jews were corrupt and parasitic. And they would measure the cranium size and the shape of the head and try to prove these things. And so even though many Jews in Western Europe had become virtually indistinguishable from Germans or Frenchmen in culture, economic status, or even religion by conversion, this is the case of Mendelssohn. Race is immutable. You can't convert out of your race. You can convert from your religion, but you can't leave your race. This is racial anti-Semitism. Your racial descent cannot be changed. And this is the main and crucial change which occurs in the late 19th century to transform religious difference into racial difference. Now, what's interesting, and what I want us to think about a little bit, is the ways in which Jews respond to this challenge. And anti-Semitism in Germany, and I think it's important, it has a moment in the late 1870s into the early 1880s. It has a moment, not a pronounced moment. Anti-Semitic political parties in the newly created state of Germany never become incredibly popular in this period of time, but it plays an important role. And one of the roles is it helps Germans in the newly created German state define their self-image of what it means to be a German. It helps to create the idea of what is the German nation in distinction against, well, for some anti-Semites, well, we know what we're not, and we're not Jews. And it begins to construct this national identity against what it is not. It also, and I think this is really important for us to think about now in the current moment, it is taking place in a context of huge political change, right? Think about it. You have new countries being created, right? A new nation state system being created. So you have political change that's taking place that can be confusing and bewildering. And you have rapid industrialization that is taking place. So you have economic and technological changes that are taking place, fears of capitalism, fears of exploitation of workers, foreign competition between Germany and France in particular in this period of time. And so anti-Semitism plays an important role politically for those who don't want to identify with socialism, perhaps, but need to express some other rejection against the sort of, an anti-modern sentiment, right? The challenges, the disruptions, the upheaval of the modern period. And so this is one of the ways where we can see anti-Semitism in the modern period playing a really important role politically, right? We're going to talk about it as a mechanism for scapegoating, for example, where we will see periods periodically throughout history where anti-Semitism flares up because it is useful. It's, as one scholar calls it, it's a convenient hatred. It's very easy to use for political purposes. As one thinker, one socialist leader in this period of time, the 1880s, referred to anti-Semitism, he called it the socialism of fools, right? It is a convenient political ideology that helps to explain all your problems by projecting it onto an easily targeted group. So there are periods of time where we're going to see it flare up periodically. One of the interesting things that happens as we see the spread of the Haskalah is, I think, a change in the way in which Jews are going to respond to the threat of anti-Semitism. So, for example, in Eastern Europe, as the Haskalah spreads to Russia, and you see thinkers like Judah Leib Gordon who are advocating for Jews to acculturate and become more Russian and learn the Russian language and become cultured Russian, and as he said, be a man abroad, right? Be a Russian in your everyday life and a Jew in your private life, right? This distinction that many of us will be familiar with, right? You can be a Jew in your personal space, function like the citizens of the countries around you in your everyday life, a brother to your countrymen, a servant to your king, right? He can preach this until those illusions are completely shattered by anti-Semitism, by pogroms, by outbreaks of violence. And so one of the interesting questions in both Central Europe and in Eastern Europe is, what do Jews do after their illusions of acceptance are shattered, right? So they believe in emancipation. They believe that they can become citizens of the countries in which they're living. They believe in the Enlightenment, that people are becoming more cultured and more politically advanced, and that we're living in a time of progress, and that democracy is on the march, and everyone will be treated equally, right? A liberty, égalité, fraternité, right? And then anti-Semitism slaps you in the face. So what do you do, right? How do you respond to this? What's interesting about the modern period is that instead of traditional types of responses like Kiddush Hashem that we talked about earlier, or religious sort of disputations and rivalries that might take place, or a retraction into traditional modes of self-defense that might take place, what you see instead are new political developments that say, in the modern period, Jews have to respond to persecutions and violence in a different way politically. So the Kishinev Pogrom is a great example of this. When we have this outbreak of violence against Jews in the southern part of the Russian Empire, and this pogrom where Jews are killed in 1903, around, of course, as many of these take place around the time of Easter, right? So this is the anti-religious component of it, right? Jews continue to be accused of deicide, of killing Jesus. We have these outbreaks of violence that are spurred up. But I show you this conclusion to this poem by Chaim Nachman Bialik in The City of Slaughter, in which instead of mourning the destruction of Jewish life, instead of saying that Jews who died to sanctify God's name, he makes fun of the Jewish response. He said, Jews, how did they respond? They responded concealed and cowering. The so-called sons of Maccabees, they crammed by scores in the sanctuaries of their shame, so sanctified my name. What a poet like Chaim Nachman Bialik is looking for in the beginning of the 20th century is a modern Jewish response to anti-Semitism. And for him, that modern Jewish response to anti-Semitism is going to be in the form of Zionism, right? Now, Zionism, and I'll come back to these other Jewish responses later on, and we can think about it. Zionism emerges for two reasons. On the one hand, it's a solution to the problem of anti-Semitism in the modern period. And on the other, it's a solution to the challenges of assimilation and emancipation, right? Jews have had this offer to become citizens of the countries in which they're living. Jews have assimilated and acculturated. They've left behind some of their traditional self-conceptions. They've, in some cases, tried to gain acceptance. It perhaps has eaten away at the core of sort of Jewish tradition. And then they encounter anti-Semitism. So what do you do when you, on the one hand, have left the traditional mold, but on the other hand, the liberal offer of gaining acceptance has been slammed shut in your face? And so what you end up having is an idea like Zionism suggested as a modern solution to this problem of anti-Semitism. Shalom Avineri describes it as the most fundamental revolution in Jewish life. It takes a secular self-identity of the Jews as a nation for a traditional and Orthodox self-identity in religious terms. And I can't go into this in depth, but for some of the early Zionist thinkers, like Leon Pinsker, their Zionism comes directly from trying to understand this question of why does hatred of the Jews continue into the modern period? We think that remember, in 1882, you're living in the most modern and cultured period in history. When Herzl writes The Jewish State in 1896, it's the most modern and cultured period that he's familiar with. And so he's trying to understand, why does anti-Semitism continue, right? Just as we in the year 2020 try to understand, why is anti-Semitism still continuing? And so Pinsker and Herzl try to diagnose the causes of anti-Semitism, right? Where does it come from? Pinsker was an assimilated Russified doctor living in Odessa, and he diagnosed the problem of Judeophobia. And he said the problem is that as long as the Jews do not have their own home, they will always be seen as the other. So they will be projected onto them, right? As long as they maintain this distinct identity, people who are native to a country will see Jews as foreigners. People who are owners will see Jews as beggars coming to take their property. People who are poor will see Jews as those who exploit them, right? People who are patriots of their country will see Jews as, a man without a country. Everyone is going to hate them. It's again this idea of this convenient hatred. You can project whatever your political needs are onto the Jew. For Herzl as well, right? When he writes Der Judenstaat, the Jewish state, in 1896, and then convenes the first Zionist Congress in 1897, he is trying to understand this problem of anti-Semitism. He is very much influenced by what he sees in the Dreyfus affair in 1894, when he goes to cover the trial of Alfred Dreyfus in Paris. He is shocked by what he sees of these crowds in the streets chanting death to Dreyfus, death to the Jews. Although we heard a lecture earlier this semester by Derek Penslar, a biography of Herzl, and Penslar said maybe the crowds weren't saying death to the Jews, maybe they were saying death to Judas when they were talking about Dreyfus. We can debate whether that makes a difference or not. Either way, it was influencing Herzl in the idea of trying to understand, why does anti-Semitism continue even in a place like Paris, even in France, where a Jew like Dreyfus, who has reached the highest levels of the French military, cannot get a fair trial, is seen as a traitor because he is Jewish. And so for Herzl, his solution to this is, well, it's because Jews have no national home of their own. And so Jews are always seen as a threat. They're always seen as a foreigner. They're always seen as an outsider. Their motives are always questioned. And so how do you solve this? You create a Jewish state. And if you create a Jewish state, Jews will not be seen as other. Jews will not be seen as foreign. And you will solve the problem of anti-Semitism once and for all, just with the idea that you can implant in the nations of the world that the Jews have their own national home. Right? Because they won't be seen as competition anymore. They won't be seen as somebody who's coming to take over their land. Herzl says, we are one people. Our enemies have made us one without our consent. As repeatedly happens in history, distress binds us together, and thus united we suddenly discover our strength. We are strong enough to form a state, and indeed a model state. We possess all the human material resources necessary for this purpose. And indeed, he writes in the Jewish state, he writes that, some might say that this will be a long drawn out affair for us to have a state and solve the problem of anti-Semitism this way. Even in the most favorable circumstances, many years might elapse before the founding of the state is underway. In the meantime, Jews in 1,000 places will suffer insult, mortification, abuse, drubbings, depredation, and death. But no, once we begin to execute the plan, anti-Semitism will cease at once and everywhere, for it is the conclusion of peace. Now we know it hasn't solved the problem of anti-Semitism, but it is quite telling, this idea that the only way for Jews to gain acceptance in the modern world is to form their own national home. And it's telling for Herzl that he believed that this would solve the problem of anti-Semitism. It also means that when the state of Israel is created, it is in a sense this idea that Zionism says that emancipation, meaning getting citizenship in the countries in the diaspora, enlightenment, acceptance, are simply not possible, right? That the only solution to Jewish existence in the modern world and the only solution to anti-Semitism is to give up on the promise of emancipation and for Jews to move to their own national home. That's the only way for Jews to have a normal coexistence with the other countries of the world. Now, sure enough, not only does Herzl publish the Jewish state, and not only does he organize the World Zionist Congress and the first Zionist Congress to sort of bring together all the fellow travelers who believe like him. And by the way, we should point out this is a minority viewpoint at the time, right? Most Jews are not Zionists. Most Jews think this is a completely far-fetched idea. Most Jews in the Russian Empire who are seeking a solution to their economic problems at the time are moving to America. They're not going to a backwater of the Ottoman Empire in Palestine. Be that as it may, for the anti-Semites of the world, it presents a very convenient sort of framework of, aha, see, all the Jews of the world are coming together and they're hatching some kind of a master plan to take over the world. And in a sense, this is where we get one of these most famous probably the most famous anti-Semitic forgery, which is written at the behest of Russian secret police in the beginning of the 20th century. probably written in France by a Russian agent, which imagines a meeting of these sort of learned elders of Zion. This is the protocols of the elders of Zion who come together with a plot to take over the world. And while the exact origin of the protocols is unknown, its intent was to portray the Jews as conspirators against the state. There's 24 chapters or protocols, which are alleged meetings of Jewish leaders, and the protocols describe the secret plans to rule the world by taking over the economy, controlling the media, fostering religious conflict. And it has had a remarkable afterlife, despite the fact that it has been debunked numerous times. There are editions that are published all over Europe and then the United States, South America, Japan, and the first Arabic translation appears in the 1920s. Of course, Henry Ford publishes it in the Dearborn Independent, a series of articles based on the protocols called the International Jew. And of course, then Adolf Hitler and Joseph Goebbels praise Ford and the International Jew. And I included in the documents, and we can discuss this, excerpts from the protocols, which imagine this cabal of sort of elderly Jews coming together to take over the world, inventing political ideologies which will enable them to have their plan of world domination. For example, in all parts of the world, and this comes from the protocols, the words liberty, equality, and fraternity have brought whole legions into our ranks through our blind agents, carrying our banners with delight. Meanwhile, these words were worms which destroyed the prosperity of the Goys, everywhere destroying peace, quiet, and solidarity, undermining all the foundations of states. You will see subsequently that this aided our triumph, the supposed elders of the Jews are saying, for it also gave us, among other things, the opportunity to grasp the trump card, the abolition of privileges, in other words, the very essence of the aristocracy of the Goys, which was the only protection of people and countries against us. What the protocols does is it enables you to basically label your political opponents as sort of pawns of this conspiracy of Jews in any point in history. This is why it has had such a remarkable staying power, because communism can be an invention of the Jews, right, to destroy democracy in the West, and capitalism can be an invention of the Jews, right, for the exact same reason. Socialism can be an invention of the Jews. Democracy can be an invention of the Jews. It doesn't matter. You can ascribe Jewish power to whatever your opposing viewpoint is, even in the United States. And I'll skip ahead, but I think it's important for our context to see that for Jews who are leaving Eastern Europe, both for economic opportunity in America and religious freedom in America, they encounter anti-Semitism in the American context as well. You know, the most famous case in the beginning of the 20th century is the lynching of Leo Frank, which takes place after, essentially, it's a blood libel, right? It's a charge of Leo Frank, this Yankee Jew who had come down to Atlanta, raping and murdering a Christian woman in a factory. He didn't do it. The trial made it very clear that he didn't do it, that he was being railroaded. And yet no one could be convinced of anything but the fact that the Jew had done this. And this eventually led to the birth of the Ku Klux Klan in Georgia, originally known as the Knights of Mary Phagan, after Leo Frank was lynched. And sure enough, in the 1920s, we have America's foremost anti-Semite, Henry Ford, publishing essentially the protocols in his newspaper, the Dearborn Independent. There is a long streak of anti-Semitic ideas in the Midwest and in the upper Midwest that we see with Henry Ford and Father Charles Coughlin, just two examples of that in the American context. All right, I'm going to go for about 10 more minutes and then we'll go to Q&A. But I can't talk about anti-Semitism in the modern world without talking about the rise of Nazism and the Holocaust and how we're supposed to make sense of all of this in the aftermath of the Holocaust. And I'll just note that when the Nazis come to power, and this is where context is very important. So on the one hand, you see a paper like Der Stürmer, published by Julius Streicher, the sort of one of the primary anti-Semites in Nazi Germany, who publishes this sort of, anti-Semitic newspaper, Der Stürmer, allegations, medieval allegations of Jewish ritual murder on the one hand. On the bottom, you can see the Jews are our misfortune, die Juden sind unser Unglück, right? But you have this combination of both ancient medieval allegations against the Jews with very modern allegations against the Jews. And one of the things that I think is important for us to understand at the same time about the rise of Hitler and the Nazi parties is that it is very specific to interwar Europe. It's very specific to the German defeat in the First World War. It's a political ideology that is, again, convenient in the aftermath of the First World War that's trying to explain why Germany lost. It recruits a solid core of true believers who are anti-Semites, who believe very strongly that sort of the Jews are bent on world domination and that they plan to destroy they plan to destroy German culture. But the truth is that probably the vast majority of Germans who come to support Nazism and the Nazi Party aren't originally drawn to it by anti-Semitism. That is, that the Nazi Party is successful in recruiting German voters for all sorts of other reasons, never gets more than 37% of the popular vote in any election. And then the Nazis do critical work in educating their public about what is a Jew, how Judaism, you can see with the Nuremberg laws, is passed down by descent, that Judaism, when they pass all these laws that are saying what Jews can and cannot do, and Jews are stripped of their citizenship, they have to define for the German public what is a Jew. And a Jew is defined according to bloodlines. If you have 4 Jewish grandparents, you are a Jew. If you have 3 Jewish grandparents, you are a Jew, right? So you cannot convert out of your Judaism. The German public is educated. You cannot, leave the Jewish community. It is something that is inherent. It is something that is in your blood. There is an important process of education that takes place after the Nazis come to power to educate the German public on the danger of the Jew. Nazi propaganda tries to make this case about the danger of the Jewish threat. Nazi propaganda says that there are Jews behind the Americans and the British and the Soviets allied against Germany. Nazi propaganda also alleges that Jews have created diseases to destroy the European people. And this is all behind Hitler's ideology, his core ideology, which is that race and universal struggle are at the core of all history. Germans are the victims of vast conspiracy mounted by foreign powers. Jews are behind war profiteering, reparations, inflation, and depression. Marxism and communism were invented by Jews to destroy Germany and the German state. And I think I included an excerpt from Mein Kampf for you to read. He believes that his goal is the preservation of the Aryan race, and that he has essentially been sent by God to save Germany. And I'm sorry, I'm going to skip through a bunch of this history in the American context. He essentially believes that he is on a divinely inspired mission. He, in his January 1939 speech, which is sometimes called his prophecy, he says, "I want to once again be a prophet. If the international finance Jewry inside and outside of Europe should succeed in plunging the peoples of the earth once again into a world war, the result will not be the Bolshevization of the earth and thus a Jewish victory, but the annihilation of the Jewish race in Europe." So I want us to think about, and I won't spend a lot of time talking about the Holocaust and about the final solution. only to say that what we see here with Nazi anti-Semitism and the occupation of Europe is the realization of an opportunity with the invasion of the Soviet Union to realize the Nazi goal of ridding the German state and ridding Europe of its Jewish population. So you can see here, this is from the Protocols of the Wannsee Conference, which lists the numbers of Jews and basically outlines a plan to eradicate or to evacuate, using euphemistic language, the Jewish population of Europe, what becomes known as Operation Reinhardt, which is the creation of extermination camps to, as Himmler suggests, to, quote, resettle all the Jews residing in Polish occupied or German occupied Poland, which is necessary for the separation of races and peoples demanded by the new organization of Europe and the security and cleanness of the German Reich and of its sphere of interest. So what we have in the Holocaust and with the final solution is taking this ideology of needing to maintain separation of the races, a belief in pollution that is caused by the Jewish infiltration into Aryan and European society, and the next step, which is a function of modernity, right? I think this is important for us to understand. What makes the Holocaust distinctive is that you have the German state, which at the time is the most modern state in the world. We could make an argument with the United States at the same time, and it applies all the technological tools at its disposal, all the bureaucratic organization of a modern, well-developed, functioning state to the challenge of destroying the Jews of Europe, right? So we can't say that anti-Semitism is an anti-modern project, because this is a case where you have modernity coming together with anti-Semitism to efficiently destroy the European Jewish population, right? Through extermination camps that are created that can be justified in the Nazi sort of ideology. So I think this is important for us to understand when we consider this. So I just want to wrap up before I get to some contemporary models by thinking about something that I think is an important way for us to think about how we understand the influence of anti-Semitism on the development of Jewish identity, right? How do we think about how it's influenced the ways in which Jews respond and react to anti-Semitism efficiently? I'm showing you a picture here from the aftermath of the war. This is from a DP camp in Landsberg in Germany after the war. Landsberg, ironically, the place where Hitler wrote Mein Kampf when he was imprisoned in 1923 and 1924. And this is a Purim spiel from Landsberg, where you have a survivor of the Holocaust a year after liberation dressing up as Hitler and enacting the Purim story, but with the modern day Haman, right, in the guise of Hitler. And it reminds me of this joke, which Jews would tell during the war. Hitler, not being a religious man, was inclined to consult his astrologers about the future. As the tide of the war worsened, he asked, am I going, I just have to move my, okay, am I going to lose the war? Answered affirmatively. He then asked, well, am I going to die? Consulting their charts, the astrologers again said yes. When am I going to die was Hitler's next question. This time the answer was, you're going to die on a Jewish holiday. But when? On what Jewish holiday? He asked with agitation. The reply, any day you die will be a Jewish holiday, right? So this was a joke that Jews told during the war. And I want to bring up the importance of humor as a response to anti-Semitism, because this is a long enduring Jewish response to anti-Semitism, which, as we've talked about, trying to understand it rationally, and we've talked about trying to understand it and respond to it politically. But I think humor is something that we have to insert into this discussion, because it could be one of the most efficient Jewish responses to anti-Semitism. Even if we fast forward to the present day, where we see the continuation of contemporary forms of anti-Semitism, right? So this is a chant by a Polish soccer club: "Move on, Jews, your home is at Auschwitz, send you to the gas chamber," right? How do we respond to something like this? Or in the American context, where we see the resurgence of, on the one hand, white nationalism, what we call the alt-right. This is a picture from the march in Charlottesville in 2017, or something more recent, where we see white nationalists in America conflating the Confederacy with Nazism, with the "Don't Tread on Me" flags, right? This might also be a picture from Charlottesville from that same day, right? And so we can ask this question, right? How do we respond to it? On the one hand, another joke: a Jew in a Texas bar wears a large Jewish star and a chain around his neck. A big, angry-looking redneck walks into the bar, spies the Jew, and bellows, "I hate effing Jews. Let's have a round for everyone in the bar except the gosh darn Jew." The Jew smiles. The redneck continues to order more rounds, one after another, for everyone, and he continues to exclude the Jew. Finally, with the Jew still smiling broadly, the redneck says to the bartender, "What the hell is that damn Jew smiling about? I refuse to buy him a drink. Doesn't he realize how much I hate his Jewish guts?" And the bartender replies, "Yes, sir, but Mr. Bernstein is the owner," right? So this is, I think we have to engage with this question of, is humor an effective response to anti-Semitism? I just want to note, and I think somebody's unmuted, if you wouldn't mind muting yourself. I just want to note that tomorrow is the 2-year anniversary of the Tree of Life shooting. We have to think about this in the context of anti-Semitism, the resurgence of anti-Semitism in America. We can talk about, when is anti-Zionism anti-Semitism? Contemporary forms of Holocaust denial, which are rampant in certain parts of the Arab world, which are conflated with anti-Zionism. This is from the Iranian Holocaust denial cartoon contest. Which is alleging, again, think about the protocols, that there is a Jewish conspiracy to invent the Holocaust, to enable the Jews to create the Jewish state, to persecute the Palestinians, right? So it is, again, the enduring power of something like the protocols. And so I want us, by way of concluding, to think about how anti-Semitism influences the ways in which Jews conceive of themselves, right? Should it influence the ways in which Jews think of themselves? Should it influence the ways in which Jewish communities organize? Should Jews laugh it off? Should they say, we can't understand something that is irrational? Should it lead Jews to Zionism, and to say the only solution to anti-Semitism is a strong Jewish state, is a strong form of self-defense? Should it ask Jews to engage in vigilance, in memory, in pointing out every single case, in believing in the power of democracy to protect Jews and to protect minority groups, like the Anti-Defamation League, which says that we have to unite and ally ourselves with all persecuted groups, because wherever Jews are persecuted, wherever Blacks are persecuted, wherever any minority group is persecuted, we have to defend against this. It's always the tip of the iceberg. The new Borat movie just came out. We can discuss, is this an effective response against anti-Semitism, right? Satire, making fun of the persecutors. Larry David engages with anti-Semitism quite a bit. This is from one of my favorite Yiddish humor shows, where they see the swastika spray painted in a park in Montreal. And he says, it's not just anti-Semitic, it's anti-Sementish, right? It's an attack on cement, not just on Semites. So, okay, I've spoken enough. I think I've gone on for way too long. Had I been in charge of myself, I would have cut myself off. So I'm going to stop my share. And I've thrown a lot of material at you. I would love to hear your comments and your feedback. So please feel free to type in the chat, or say you have a question. I think I'll go to gallery mode so I can try to see everybody if you're raising your hands. Adam, Go ahead and just unmute yourself.
Gotcha. Sorry. So, Dr. Patt, since you were mentioning Salo Baron, did he engage with historians who have argued that even during anti-Semitism's lowest pervasiveness, that there always has been at least some anti-Jewish hatred in the Galut, and that Jewish progress always has therefore been in jeopardy, in contrast to Baron's view of anti-Jewish hatred as something that has disappeared and reappeared.
So, Adam, can you say that one more time? So you're asking, did Baron engage with, say that one more time? I just want to make sure I'm understanding your question.
Right, that's right. Did he engage with other historians who may have argued that there always has been and always will be at least some anti-Jewish hatred in every part of the diaspora, and that Jewish progress always has therefore been in jeopardy, as opposed to, if I recall correctly, Baron, I think you mentioned Baron viewed anti-Jewish hatred as something that has periodically disappeared and reappeared, then disappeared and reappeared.
Right. Okay, gotcha. So I think one of the interesting questions is sort of, how do we understand the continuation of anti-Semitism both throughout history and into the modern period, right? Do we see it as the defining feature of sort of how Jews should organize and affiliate themselves politically and relate to their neighbors in the countries in which they live in? Or is it something periodic that should not define all Jewish existence, right? We're aware it's there. We know it, it flares up from time to time, but instead of focusing on periods of persecution, we should focus on the long stretches of sort of fruitful existence in the diaspora, right? Where Jews have been very successful living in their communities in the diaspora. Periodically there will be sort of an outbreak of violence, but our history and the way that we write our history shouldn't focus on these persecutions and these outbreaks of violence. The way that we write our history should really focus on all the good times, right? Don't focus on sort of, the negative times are there, that the times of persecution are there, it might happen periodically, but that historians have spent too much time focusing on that, and they have to let that influence the way in which they understand all of Jewish history, right? And if you say, well, it's all defined by anti-Semitism, then you tend to look for the negative aspects, and you say it's not, and it becomes political. You say it's not really possible for Jews to have fruitful coexistence in the diaspora, right? We're deceiving ourselves if we think we can become citizens of the countries in which we live and have good relations with our neighbors, and that the only solution is to leave the countries in which we're living, move to a country like Israel, and protect ourselves in that way, right? So, two very different ways of understanding sort of the ways in which politics can influence the way that we view our history.
Thank you.
Rachel, I see your hand.
This might be a footnote, but it was in the reading, and I've never heard anything quite like it before. Weininger, where he talks first about Karl Marx, and then this guy Weininger, who says that Judaism is not a race of people or a creed; it's the feminine. Is this something? Is this more than a footnote, or is it something that other thinkers were talking about? And Yeah,
so I'm glad that you brought up the Michael Meyer article. I mean, I think it's interesting, and he, sort of this overlooked historical figure because he doesn't live very long, but sort of this philosophical engagement with, and I think one of Meyer's points is that he's trying to understand himself, Weininger, and understand sort of his own psychology, and he sees this as inextricable from his Jewishness, right? That it's sort of he's trying to separate out, as Meyer says here, beset by troublesome awareness of his Jewish origins and irrational guilt over his sensuality, Weininger linked Judaism and sexuality as the bane of modern society from which it must liberate itself for its own moral welfare. Thus, Weininger was able temporarily to divest the private inner struggle of its painful effect by removing it to the public sphere. And what's interesting about it is, I mean, and it's interesting that Meyer brings this up, because in the article itself, he almost makes this argument, or he does make this argument, that there are these two, and this is part of a larger series of lectures that he gave on sort of what are the major influences on the formation of Jewish identity in the modern world. And so on the one hand, when he talks about the Enlightenment, or the Haskalah, which is essentially trying to draw Jews out of their sort of distinctive forms of organization, he agrees that anti-Semitism is a really important opposing force that continues to push Jews into their sort of distinctive particularism. And what's interesting is that he pulls out this character of Otto Weininger, and alludes to the importance of like individual psychology in this case, and how it influences one's own political viewpoint, right? Which is, I mean, I don't write intellectual history, but I think it's really interesting to consider sort of how the psychology of these individuals influences the way in which they conceive of the world. And so this is a case of somebody who's very much, like, he's alluding to the fact that he has all these internal struggles, which he then projects onto his sort of diagnosis of, Jewish identity in the world.
Thanks.
Mom, I think you had a question. Narit. Oh.
Yeah, my question is, should we ignore anti-Semitism or fight it?
Okay. So that's, I think
No
that's,
question.
Can I elaborate?
please.
Depends under what circumstances.
Finland.
Up to Trump, I felt, you don't like me? Tough luck. It's your Trump. It's your problem. Since the phenomenon of Trump came about, I see the threat to any one of us Jews.
Mm-hmm.
And we can't ignore it.
Okay. So I think this is, and thank you. So my parents are joining us from Santa Fe. So this is not just a Connecticut party. This is a continent-wide party. So I'll just say that I think it's a really good question, right? Which is, and this is what I wanted us to think about, right? Like how it influences the ways in which Jews organize and organize politically, and think about the ways in which they engage with the world around them. And that is the heart of the question. At what point do Jews decide that, you stop laughing it off and you say, this is a very serious problem that we have to engage with? The Borat example, so, it might seem silly, but I think the Borat example, or the Sacha Baron Cohen example, is a really interesting case study. Why do I point this out? Because Sacha Baron Cohen makes the first Borat movie in 2006, I think. And when he makes the first Borat movie in 2006, he finds all these sort of characters that seem, in the American context, that seem peripheral, right? He finds these racists, he finds these anti-Semites, he finds these xenophobes, he finds these, homophobes all over, and he uses this character to draw them out, right? Because Borat is xenophobic and homophobic and anti-Semitic and racist, while speaking Hebrew the whole time, like that's his inside joke. But when we saw, I'm going to speak collectively, when people saw the movie in 2006, we could laugh at those anti-Semites and racists for being so foolish, right? We could laugh at them and say, haha, look how ridiculous they are. We are enlightened. We, live here in a progressive American context, and they are outliers. When we look at the movie today, or now he's updated it with a 2020 version, we say, oh my God, right? What was Sacha Baron Cohen aware of in 2006 that we should have been paying more attention to, right? And I point that out because we can see And certainly since the election of Barack Obama, right? So on the one hand, we think to ourselves, oh, wow, this is like a belief in progress, right? A belief that, oh, America is so progressive and we're moving forward and we've elected our first Black president. And now we see the reaction against it, which is the people who felt so threatened by it that their sort of, white identity was so threatened either by the election of a Black president or the rising power of Jews in America that they were organizing. And we have to be really, obviously, very worried about this threat. The thing that I didn't mention in the talk that I think is important for us to engage is the power of the internet, right? So that's a difference even from 2006 to 2020. It just keeps getting, the algorithms keep getting much more sophisticated, right? So you think about conspiracy theories, like the internet was made for conspiracy theories. So you think about anti-Semitism as a kind of the original conspiracy theory that explains in an irrational form all of your problems and projects it onto, see, that's the reason. And then you have the internet, which can spread it. You don't have to wait for Henry Ford to publish a monthly newspaper, or you don't have to worry for a pamphlet to be handed around your village or whatever. You can get it instantaneously. And then Facebook knows that, oh, you clicked on that, you like, this story. Well, I'm going to feed you more stories. It's not a human doing it, it's a computer doing that. I'm going to feed you more stories that are anti-Semitic in nature, or that, Zuckerberg, it took him forever to get rid of the Holocaust denial, right? But the damage is done so much, right? Because I'm going to feed you more Holocaust denial stories. You didn't even know you wanted it. And a computer is going to feed it to you even more, right? So I think these are the kinds of things where you say, when do we fight it? Well, we can't laugh it off anymore, but we have to, this is fighting the means of distribution, right? This is where we have to regulate the social media companies, the tech companies, because they've become a malevolent influence, right? In spreading anti-Semitism. So I see that Philip has a hand up and Marshall has a hand up. Go ahead, Philip, and then Marshall. Just unmute yourself, Philip.
Okay.
Go ahead. Yeah.
The whole concept of anti-Semitism, it seems that, as a summation, it's very complex. It's not simple. And if you think that that you find, I'm not calling it a solution, but an approach to it, you're misguided. There are many. It is more like, as they refer, you're looking through the lens a certain way. And you can filter the lens, you can filter it, and you can look at it as humor, you can look at it as a threat, as a very severe threat. You can see it any number of ways. Certainly, social media is filtering, lensing you in so many ways that it's hard to escape, and you have to take them all seriously. Even the parts that are funny are not funny. It's all very serious. For anybody that's interested, you had that little clip where you said showed the ADL for Never Is Now. And that was the meeting at which Sacha Baron Cohen spoke as he was the speaker. And you can watch that on YouTube. It's worth watching. As he said, he doesn't do serious, but he was serious. And it's interesting to see him not using humor as his vehicle, but using his real voice, his serious voice, because he again is attacking anti-Semitism and saying we have to take these things seriously. So just a comment.
Yeah, thank you. And I'll put up that slide again at the end, which is their next, it's coming up in just a couple of weeks, the next ADL Never Is Now conference, which will be virtual, obviously, but would enable us to join and participate. And yeah, when he made that speech, and this is a year ago, calling out Facebook, essentially, that was the target of that speech. And So this is a case where you have somebody who's a very prominent figure who, is perceived as a humorist. So when he speaks seriously, it's interesting because people listen to him and they said, oh my God, right? Like we have to listen to what Sacha Baron Cohen is saying because he's serious right now. And he did sort of take on Zuckerberg and Facebook and say, you have this huge problem that you're not addressing. I think one of the points that you make is that while I raised this question at the beginning, like how important is it for us to understand something irrational, right? To take our rational approach to try to understand something irrational. What I do think is important is that we have to fight, and this goes back to the question that my parents asked before, we have to fight the distribution of this sort of evil ideology because, and we probably have to be sophisticated and savvy in our use of social media to confront it, right? We have to sort of use the same technology, but in a positive way. Because I think one of the big things that worries me is that you will see sort of all sorts of anti-Semitic groups. So talking about white nationalists or neo-Nazis, but you can also see groups that sort of are Holocaust deniers, both on the left, on the right, anti-Israel, like you name it. And you can use social media to spread your idea and reach 11-year-olds, 12-year-olds, 13-year-olds who didn't know that they were not anti-Semitic until they started to be exposed to information that says, oh, here's the truth for you, right? And the challenge is that, they are not trained, as has been throughout history, to separate out what is fact and what is fiction. And it's, coming up to me as something that is authoritative and authentic. And that's the real danger. So then we do have to, I think, regulation of these companies for, to stop the spread of this type of information is incredibly important.
Very.
Yeah. So Marshall and then Regina.
Yeah. Avi, it's in a way, to me, it's an anomaly that that there is still so much anti-Semitism when our stated position as Jews is one of our so-called planks even is to repair the world, and yet we're the subject of anti-Semitism. That's the beginning of what I was going to say. The second part of it is that I have two very close friends for a long time, who are probably to the right of Attila the Hun, and obviously are Trump supporters. And they keep talking about the Black Lives Matter movement having a plank which is anti-Semitic, and I'm not sure, because I heard someone say that the Black Lives Matter movement doesn't have the plank, but it's another group with it. It's similar. It's like instead of BLM, it's MBL or something like that has the plank. But the synagogues and other organizations are going out of their way to try to set up meetings with our Black brethren, with ministers and so forth. And we're really trying hard to help them and so forth. And I don't know how to respond to my friends who are saying that the Black Lives Matter movement is anti-Semitic.
Okay.
I have to admit, I have not read up on it, and
yeah,
I only them. So
let me give you some suggestions for how
okay.
to,
Let me shut my
respond. And I'll just say by way of context that so I set out with my framing about in the beginning about, with the process of emancipation, do Jews believe in the power of democracy, right? Do we believe in sort of the idea that we can create a liberal state where, and by liberal, I mean sort of they protect the rights of the individual, not the labels, but just protect the rights of the individual, and that we can all become citizens and create a society where people are treated equally, and protect individual freedoms, right? So do we believe in that? And if we believe in that, then we have a responsibility to uphold that democratic system. Again, small d democratic system. And if we believe in that and we have a responsibility to protect the democratic system, then we have to, as a minority group that wants to make sure that our individual rights are protected so that we're able to practice in the way that we want, and we're able to affiliate in the way that we want, and we're able to sort of be Jews in the way that we want in the American context, and we have a responsibility to protect the rights of other minority groups, right? So that is, I think, important in terms of a framing about, like, do we believe, how should we respond to anti-Semitism if we want to function and live in a functioning democracy? And so on that level, right, confronting anti-Semitism and racism go hand in hand, because we have a responsibility to protect democracy, right? That's what we're actually talking about here, because all racism and anti-Semitism go together, right? Anti-Semitism is a type of racism. Wherever you find anti-Semitism, you will find racism as well, right? And you'll find anti-Black racism. And this idea that you can protect the rights of one group by persecuting another group is destroying democracy. So if we're here and we believe that we can live in a free and open democracy, then we have a responsibility to protect it. So that's one thing, which is why we as Jews need to strive to protect the rights of everyone in this democracy, right? Jews and Blacks and Muslims and you name it, right? All the antis, they all go together in one way or another. So that's why it's very difficult to sort of hear Jews who are sort of separating out. Like, if I'm going to protect my Jewish identity as a minority, then I have a responsibility to protect the rights of all minority groups. Okay. To the specific question of BLM, so what I would say is, this is and I'm sorry to say it this way, but it's become a kind of right-wing talking point. The idea that, I'm going to split Jews from Blacks by saying, this is a right-wing talking point, I'm going to split Jews from Blacks by saying that, oh, no, you got to watch out for that group because they're anti-Semitic. So this is trying to divide, right? Divide and conquer. And the other thing is the movement, right? So when people say, oh, there was a plank in the original BLM platform, right, which you can go back to 2014, and you could think about sort of when the movement was starting to gain some traction after, the killings of Eric Garner and Trayvon Martin and others. And was there something in the original platform that might have been perceived as anti-Semitic? It's possible. However, the movement, so on the one hand, you have a movement that evolves over time. The 2020 version of Black Lives Matter is different from the 2014 version. And the other thing is, let's forget about the movement, what is BLM, and just ask ourselves a question, right? Do Black Lives Matter? And if you answer yes in the affirmative, which I, of course, how could I not say that every Black Lives Matter, then forget about a movement, a platform, just ask that question, right? And I don't know if I can engage in a conversation with someone who doesn't believe that, right? So but that is separating out sort of the moral question from the semantics of what's in a movement and what's in the platform of a movement. So that's my response. I think Regina, you had a hand up, and go ahead, Regina.
Okay, so I think
and I see Edie down there also. So after Regina, Edie, yeah.
Wonderful discussion tonight and all the information that has been shared. I think we, as a collective community of Jews, have responsibility to educate people about what it means to be Jewish, and the the Holocaust and genocide education work that is going on and hopefully will be increased in this state and other states is really important. And that brings me to say that the more insular we are, the more dangerous it is for us, because then people don't understand us and don't know us as people and don't see us as supporters of their rights and their beliefs. And that has to come through education. It has to start very, very early. I think we have to have more wonderful storybooks for children, for parents to read to children, that really introduces children to, I have a right, you have a right, we have rights. There's enough in this world to sustain us all. And the more we understand each other, the more we are together, not to coerce each other group to become something else, but to learn and appreciate. And we all have a responsibility to engage in that.
Yeah, thank you, Regina. So I'll say that, definitely in terms of sort of engaging in early childhood education and starting early. And I'll say one of the things that I do find, and I want to address something you brought up about sort of the way in which Jews tell their story to the outside world, because this is something that, so this is again engaging with the question of like, how do we respond?
Right.
And the question of how do we respond is, do we respond with a positive message, right? Which then asks the question of, yes, we're vigilant, and yes, we focus on anti-Semitism, and yes, so it's so interesting. And I am like very much involved in Holocaust studies. I was a big proponent of passing, law in the state of Connecticut that we should learn about Holocaust and genocide, and that that's required, right? But I also wish that we had a law that you learn about American Jewish history, right? And you learn about all the different aspects, that you don't just learn about the Holocaust in your curriculum when you learn about Jews. So that's an interesting question for us to ask, right? Like, what are the, and I used to work at the Holocaust Museum, and our museum on the National Mall in Washington was the Holocaust Museum. It wasn't this amazing museum, which has subsequently been opened in Philadelphia, the National Museum of American Jewish History, which probably, right, if you're thinking about apples and apples, like that one should be on the National Mall, right? Because that tells our American Jewish story. But that's just something interesting for us to think about. What stories do we want to tell about ourselves? I also, one of the things, and we had earlier today, Regina, we had our, as we had our Holocaust Educators Workshop. And the Greenberg Center does this every year, the workshop. And one of the interesting questions is Holocaust education effective in combating anti-Semitism? Right? This is it's not as obvious an answer as you might think. People have studied this. Is there a correlation between how much students learn about the Holocaust, which you've probably seen all the research that the levels of historical knowledge in general are abysmal. It's not just about the Holocaust. Like, American kids today know very little about what happened in the past. It's not just the Holocaust, but it's not a given that you teach them about the Holocaust and that makes them less anti-Semitic, right? So there's more work that needs to be done besides that. Edie, and then I think Joel, I know you have a question as well. Go ahead, Edie.
Okay. Yes. Well, I was teaching the Holocaust studies, and I taught in New Jersey and New York. And we did Holocaust studies for many, many years. But there's a lot more to it, just exactly what you said. And one of the things that really gets to me, Charlottesville's 3 years ago, Pittsburgh 2 years ago. And what's been happening in the last few years here in this country between the Blacks and Browns and Jews and all of the things that have happened that have made me absolutely nauseous about what's going on here. When I first saw Sacha Baron Cohen, I wasn't appreciating him. I was annoyed that he was making fun of the Jews. And then I watched, there was a film called The Trial of the Chicago 7. Did you see it?
I haven't seen it yet, but it's recently out on Netflix, right?
Well, he's in it.
Mhm.
But then he spoke, and all of a sudden I saw the real Sacha Baron Cohen. And he was talking about how he is a very religious Jew and he really appreciates Judaism. But he was making fun to make people enjoy it.
Mhm.
But the real one came out and it was like, oh, wow. And then, because you and I have had conversations about making fun of all of this, and then it hit me like a ton of bricks because he's doing it to try to get people to understand the Jews. But it's also, we have to understand the Blacks, the Browns, the Native Americans, all of us.
Right.
Help.
Thank you, Edie. No, I think you raise a really important point. Also, I mean, obviously, right. So, like we've talked about sort of protecting a democratic society and appreciating difference. I mean, it is incredibly important to have students learn about everybody's experiences, right? And I think that our educational system, and I know that our teachers are dedicated enough to take on this challenge. They want to take on this challenge. I will say, yeah, Regina mentioned before sort of the idea of protecting the rights of the individual. And I'll say that one of the things I find encouraging about the rising generation of, let's say millennials, sort of the new students, is that they seem to be really engaged with this question of sort of human rights, protecting the rights of the individual, about, they're angry at us for not engaging with climate change. They're angry at us for the mess of the political system that we've left to them. But it actually does make me feel fairly optimistic about the future, because I think that they'll take that sort of righteous indignation and apply it in a positive direction. The humor thing that you brought up about Sacha Baron Cohen, I mean, I do wonder when I watch a film like Borat, and I just watched it this weekend, the most recent one. I mean, there's a ton of Hebrew in the movie, right? Like
Yes.
he's anti-Semitic, racist, idiot journalist from Kazakhstan, but he's speaking Hebrew in the whole movie. And I get it, and I hear him, and I'm impressed with his Hebrew, but I don't know if anybody,
Exactly.
99% of the people watching on Amazon Prime are not going to get the joke, right? So I appreciate that he wrote a joke for me and my fellow Jews, right? But I don't.
How about the Polish?
Yeah, dziękuję. Yeah.
Dziękuję.
Yeah, I don't know if it's efficient or not. All right, Joel, you've been very patient. I know you have a question you've been wanting to ask, so I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, and I take it you're speaking about the note I sent you yesterday.
Yes.
Yeah, so I thought your history of anti-Semitism through the modern era was just superb. It was wonderful listening to it. And there's so much depth to it. I wish in a way that we had more time to go into a lot of the, whether it's your slides or the stories about Mendelssohn and others, because there's so much to the history that we just right now don't have time for. But one area that we haven't had time for is to talk not just about the history of anti-Semitism, but about its causes. And we do say that it's irrational and that it's a disease, and to a large extent it is. And what I'm about to say may be viewed to some extent as heretical or taboo, but I think it's important, as I expressed to Avi in a note yesterday, that if we want to discuss or think about not just our responses to anti-Semitism, but also what the causes of it are, and whether our responses can connect to at least some of the causes or some of the exacerbations of it, that it's important not just to blame others, however blameworthy they must be, they are, and not just to accuse others, however warranted the accusations are against those who have committed acts and expressions of anti-Semitism. But I think it's also important, as Michael Meyer's essay that we read mentions briefly, it's also important that we look within our own community to see to what extent there are Jewish behaviors, at least today, and I mean, maybe in history, but I think I'm focusing now on today because I'm an observer of today, that exacerbate existing feelings of anti-Jewish antipathy. And that relates also to what Regina and Avi and Edie and others were saying about education. We don't have enough education in our country about Jewish history, about American history, and about what it means to be Jewish. But we also don't have enough education about civics, about American civics. We talk a lot about rights, religious rights, civil rights, human rights, but the correlative of rights is responsibilities. And I believe that our rights imply and import responsibilities. And among those responsibilities is the responsibility of everyone to behave in a certain way, to obey the law. And if we want to be welcomed and feel comfortable, and for others to feel comfortable with us, we not only have to obey the law, but we have to try to fit in to some extent. Now, we as a Jewish people hold ourselves to some degree apart. We are particularistic. We are proud of our distinct identity. And so it's a bit of a fine balance to be both open about being Jewish, but yet also behaving in a way that fits in. And unfortunately, although by and large, most Jews do, there are a minority of Jews who don't. So for example, I think we've seen on television in recent months what's happened with the measles epidemic in Rockland County and in parts of Brooklyn and Queens, what's happened more recently with large groups of Jews, mainly easily identifiable Hasidim or other easily identified Orthodox Jews, but not exclusively, gathering in large groups, not social distancing, not wearing masks, spreading infections, not getting vaccinated, and openly, and even not only openly, but defiantly. Question, does that exacerbate anti-Jewish antipathy? That's one example. I have observed many times Jews either openly or furtively committing income tax fraud and estate tax fraud, proudly, bragging about it. Now, when you do that openly, what do other people think about that? There are many other people who are not Jews who commit income and estate tax fraud, but we stand apart as a distinct people. And so it's incumbent upon us, I believe, to be more careful about how we behave and that we obey the law.
All right. So I'm gonna. I think I read your question before, so I'm gonna cut you off there because I know where you're going. I have enough to sort of respond. So a couple of things that that you make me think about to respond to this. One is that. So this goes back to sort of one of the points that I started with, which is that, do we think that we can organize a rational response to combat an irrational ideology or an irrational fear? I mean, we've talked about tactics that can be used to combat the spread of it, to combat the promulgation of it. But do we believe that there's a way to prevent people from believing something that is irrational? And what your question, and I think it sort of, I appreciate a provocative question that asks us to think and challenges the way we think. It asks, are there ways in which Jews behave that if only they would behave differently, would give the anti-Semites less fuel for their fire, less fodder, right? For their, less ammunition for their anti-Semitism. I think there's a long history of Jews asking this question, right? And either sort of, Van Meyer alludes to this also, right? Like shame about types of Jewish behavior. This is wrapped up in sort of different belief systems about what is the proper way for Jews to behave in the modern world, and why do those Jews have to keep living that way? I think, so on my first response is that I don't know if we can, control what anti-Semites are gonna believe. The second thing is, to what extent can we say that we ascribe certain types of behavior to the fact that the person who behaves in that way is Jewish? So I'll give you a couple of examples, right? Anti-vaxxers. So on the one hand, you have lots of people who believe in, anti-vaccination conspiracy theories who are not Jewish. And we don't say the fact that they are Protestants makes them prone to be anti-vaxxers. We don't say the fact that they are, so by the same token, if they're Haredim living in, in Williamsburg, who are skeptical of the government, it's not necessarily just because they're Jewish that they, are skeptical of vaccines, right? So we have to ask, like, is there something about their Jewishness that is making them prone to these beliefs? Bernie Madoff, okay? So Bernie Madoff was a greedy, horrible, evil crook. He might have used his Jewish connections to enhance his criminal enterprise, right? He took advantage of Holocaust survivors like Elie Wiesel because he was Jewish. It makes like the degree of his crime, like using his Jewishness to engage in this crime, even worse for that. And yes, it's a shanda, right? The Jew behaves in this way, but I don't think it's the fact of his Jewishness doesn't explain the fact that he behaves in this way. Does that make sense, right? That we have to sort of make a distinction between that. Look, income tax fraud, some of our best presidents engage in income tax fraud, right? So there is kind of people are yelling at their screens right now, right? And that has nothing to do with Jewishness.
How about the worst presidents? You can't exclude the
worst. Sorry. I formulated it in the wrong way, right? But you get my point, right? That it's not necessarily the fact of one's Jewishness is not explanatory in that regard, right? Rob, I see your hand up. Yeah.
Joel, you raised some very good points, but and we can talk for hours about them in all likelihood, and I won't. But let me suggest this. We've clearly had the discussion within our own community for centuries or millennia about the struggle between tradition and modernity. And different communities, sub-communities of our people make different choices. I don't think it's acceptable to say that those parts of our community that choose to adhere to a more traditional lifestyle and continue to dress like Polish nobility of a particular era need to change their behavior in order to fit in. Part of what we need to do as a melting pot society that has certain values is allow everyone to fit in on their own terms. I have to take, much as I might not make the same choice to live the way they do, I have to respect their right to do that. And within our community, I would engage the argument that some of what they're doing is contrary to the very principles that have been passed down over the millennia. But that's not an anti-Semitism point. That's a point of Jewish values. But if we require people to conform, then we're losing something.
Yeah, I'm not asking them to. I'm not suggesting they should conform. That was not my point. I agree with you, Rob. All I meant is that when on the particular point, that I was making about health mandates. When people who are clearly identified as Jews, or identify them, or not Hasidic or not Orthodox, but identify themselves as Jews, because we are vulnerable to this, it's important that, I mean, we not openly, defiantly flout public health mandates.
Well, I would agree with that, but for different reasons. Our president openly flouts public health mandates, and it has nothing to do with his ethnic, identification.
Right.
But he's not vulnerable to charges of anti-Semitism.
But I would say, and
that's what we're trying to ward off.
And I'm gonna, in the interest of time, I'm going to sort of cut us short here. But I'll just say that we didn't even talk about. So we're talking about anti-Semitism or we might be thinking by and large about the experience of anti-Semitism for Jews who, to use the term, might be trying to pass, right? Might not be wearing outward markers of their Jewishness in everyday life. And that makes the sort of experience of anti-Semitism all the more shocking, right? Because we say, well, we think that we're fitting in, right? We think that we've acculturated and we've Americanized, and we're still shocked by the fact of the continuation of anti-Semitism. And we haven't engaged with the fact of how much worse probably the levels of persecution for those who have those outward markers of Jewishness, right? Like, why don't we walk around in kippot all day, right, as Jews? And I'm just saying a blanket we, because I think most of the folks on this call probably don't. And it might be sort of a question about opening ourselves up to persecution, right? Making a choice that we don't want to do that. So then you can think about the people who do choose courageously to live life like that. And then we could think that maybe we, those who are trying to pass, are making the experience of persecution even worse for them, right? I'm going to turn the question on its head and say, what are we, those who are trying to pass, doing to them and their experience of anti-Semitism? So this is really a fascinating discussion, but we're way over our time. So I think what we'll do, and I know Jonathan was here and he had to go, and Dina was also here on the call. What we're going to do, the three of us are going to confer, now that we've had 3 fascinating weeks of looking at anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism from the ancient to the modern period. And we're going to try to come up with a way to put it all together and engage with some of these questions, because I think it does raise really fascinating identity questions about how has Judaism changed? How should Judaism change? And what is the contemporary experience of anti-Semitism like? What can we learn? And we'll do this on November 9th on Kristallnacht. I just want to point out, we made a very conscious decision not to schedule it next Monday night, Erev election, because we thought people might be a little distracted next Monday night, maybe a little anxious. So we said, we'll wait, and hopefully by 2 weeks from now, we'll all be calm. So, all right, I want to thank everyone for really engaging with me and sticking with me. And it's great to see everyone, and we'll see you in 2 weeks.
And on behalf of all of us here,
the November 9th date was already, I have it in my calendar already, so you must have.
But I'm going to send you a new link for that, Marshall.
I want to tell everybody, please vote. Please hope.
Only
and please stay safe.
We did already.
It's so good to see everybody.
Be well, everyone.
yes.
Thank you, Avi.
Vote off.
Thank
Thank you so much. It was so good to see everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good to see you.
Thanks, Professor. Great lecture.
Thank you.
Thank you.